So lately I've been reading a lot of materials written by Gironda. Gironda was a bodybuilder and coach to bodybuilders like Arnold and Larry Scott back in the 70s. Vince also said a lot of weird things and had a lot of off-the-wall theories about nutrition and weightlifting for their athletes, but for some reason they worked. A lot of the things he said people believe in and use today, and some of them they still question. But one of the things that Vince often spoke about was the fact that he believed that crunches sucked. In fact, there's one story where a guy that he was training was at his gym while Vince was speaking with another individual, and Vince glances over and recognizes his student doing crunches and things like leg lifts. And he stops the conversation with the other guy, goes to the cash register, pulls out money, walks over to the guy doing crunches, taps him on the shoulder, hands him his money and says, "Get the hell out of here, you're not doing crunches in my gym." So this guy was a maniac, he was nuts, and he was adamant about certain theories that he had that he really believed in with regard to bodybuilding and strengthening. So today what I want to do is I want to go over what his idea was behind this no crunching, because most people today who are doing fitness and strength and conditioning programs are using the crunch as an abdominal strengthening exercise. So you're probably asking yourself, was this guy just completely out of his mind, or was there a little bit of a method to his madness? Now what I'm going to describe to you today is perhaps something that he considered while making wild statements like no one should ever crunch. So the very first thing I want to draw to your attention is that the crunching exercises does have some detriments to it. One of the things that it has a tendency to do, along with leg lifts, is to shorten the hip flexor. You see here I say that crunches shorten hip flexors. What happens is when you do a forward flexion movement in absence of the abdominals, and a lot of people who sit all day long, everyone, have really short hip flexors to begin with, and those hip flexors become very hyperactive. So when I say when you do crunches in absence of your abdominals, what I'm saying is that the abdominals are bypassed by the more hyperactive muscle in your hips, your hip flexors, or your psoas and iliopsoas. It's another name for it. So with that hyperactive muscle being very sensitive to movement, it jumps right into the exercise, jumps right into the movement before your abdominals get an opportunity to flex. And when you perform a lot of leg lifts and crunches with a very hyperactive, hypersensitive set of hip flexors, which again, everyone who sits pretty much has, then what happens is you end up further hypertrophying, growing, strengthening those hip flexors. And you go from a normal person who has hip flexors that are attached to the femur, cross the hip bone, and then tie into the low back around L4, L5. Nice, normal, long hip flexors, or of average length, into really shortened hip flexors. And if you can imagine, I drew a diagram here, but I'm just going to elaborate a little bit more on it. If you can imagine, like I said, the femur, if it's right here, this is the femur, your leg bone, the top big leg bone. This is and this is where it ties into your hips, upside down. These are your hips, and this is your spine. The hip flexors actually originate here, and they cross the hip flexors and tie in on the spine. Now, as you can imagine, if this muscle becomes very short, you shorten this muscle, drawing it this way, what happens is you get a tipping forward of the hips. As this draws together, the hips start to rotate that way. So if you can imagine, if these are your hips, and you've got the hip flexor crossing it, as it shortens, it does this. And mind you, this is where your abdominal wall is. Your abs are here and your butt is here. What that does is it decreases performance in several fashions, and it also decreases aesthetics. Obviously Vince was a bodybuilder, not a strength and conditioning coach, so it looks pretty bad to have a tipped forward hips with your gut spilling out the front and a big butt high up in the air. So for bodybuilders, obviously it doesn't look sexy. But for performance, if you're a strength and conditioning coach or an athlete, what it does is, because your hips are so thrown forward and your butt's so high up in the air, it decreases your ability to extend the hips. And anybody that knows anything about strength sports or explosive sports like football and baseball, where the extension of the hips are important, jumping for basketball, you understand that you've got to use that triple extension, which involves a great deal of glute strength and hip extension strength coming from the upper hamstrings and the glutes. Well, when your butt is tipped way back like that, there's absolutely no way for your body to activate that its ability to extend the hips, because the hip flexors are throwing them backwards. So decreased hip extension, decreased glute activation because the hips are or the glutes are thrown back so far, increased risk of hamstring injury. If you're familiar with baseball and Ken Griffey Jr., you remember he could not get healthy because he continuously injured his hamstrings. And the reason why that happened is because as the hips tilt forward, the hamstrings attached to the back of the hips here, all the way down, become very taut. So if you can just imagine that, I know my diagrams aren't the best, if you can just imagine that as the butt tips forward, the hamstrings become very taut, increases your risk of hamstring injury. If Ken Griffey Jr.'s strength coach knew what he was doing, he would have reduced the strength within his hip flexors and strengthened his upper hamstrings. He probably wouldn't have gotten as many injuries to the hamstring, and his butt wouldn't look so big. It decreases your ability. So when you've got this going on, this anterior pelvic tilt, that's basically what it's called, or lower cross syndrome. When you've got this lower cross syndrome or anterior pelvic tilt due to overstimulating the hip flexors from crunching exercises, you also decrease your body's ability to load axially, axial loading. So that basically means pushing down from above or pressing down on the spine. So you'll find that a lot of athletes who try to, or bodybuilders who try to squat, back squat, they'll have a really big arch, an excessive arch in their low back, and the low back starts to have a lot of pain because you're overusing it, because it's hyperextended due to the short hip flexors. Remember, it ties into your spine. As the hip flexors tie into the spine, it yanks the spine forward, down, and then increases this arch here in your low back. So sports like football, where you're having to jam into people like with your head, or you shouldn't be, that's called spearing, but when you're leaning forward with your shoulder and your axial loading, you're going to decrease your strength of trajectory. You're going to decrease your performance because you've got a chink in your armor, essentially. You know, there's the muscles in the front here, your abdominals, are underworked and your hip flexors are overworked, leading you to postural injuries. You've got screwed up posture. So this is just, that's just the tip of the iceberg of all of the different ailments that can be associated with overdeveloping the hip flexors due to faulty crunch mechanics. Now, one of the things that Vince did was he created a lot of exercises, crunching exercises like the frog crunch, that removed the activation of the hip flexors, which was very helpful, so you can isolate the abdominals. And you might want to throw that into your program. Now, you're probably asking yourself, besides the frog crunch, what the hell can you do in order to strengthen your abdominals? I'm going to pose a unique description of exercise that Vince used to do, and he taught this. If you took a look at old school bodybuilders like Arnold and Larry Scott, these guys had really small waists. I don't know if you ever get an opportunity to contrast the difference between current bodybuilders who have these big, thick bellies and Arnold and those guys back in the 70s. Their waists were tiny compared to the big, chunky abs that the guys have now. Part of the reason why is because they utilize an exercise that Vince taught called vacuuming. And this is basically where they'd cinch in, or they'd suck in their belly and pull all the organs in and create a cinching effect, if you can see my diagram here, around the abdominals. So basically, instead of crunching forward and creating that protruding type belly like we described earlier, especially if you're activating the hip flexors, this creates a corset effect where you're pulling everything in. And the way that's done is through, like I said, vacuuming. And what vacuuming does is it increases the activation of something called your thoracocolumnar fascia. And this is like a sheath of fascia that wraps your entire abdominal area and cinches in, creating intra-abdominal pressure. So if you're a strength and conditioning coach or you're a heavy weight lifter, intra-abdominal pressure is something very important to your ability to deadlift, your ability to squat. And if you're an athlete playing football or something, it's your ability to slam into somebody and take a real good hit depends on your intra-abdominal pressure. That's why you do things like take a deep breath and brace. Well, that's kind of what you're doing when you perform exercises like this that increase your intra-abdominal pressure. Very important stuff. I like to call this God's weight belt or nature's weight belt because it does basically the same thing. We wear a weight belt because it cinches us in and creates intra-abdominal pressure. Well, you've got a muscle that nature created that essentially does this, or fascia that does the same exact thing. And you do that by practicing these vacuuming type exercises. It increases your core strength for lifting. Your true core stability comes from improving posture through strengthening the thoracocolumnar fascia, amongst other things, but the center of the body is a good place to start. So you got these strength and conditioning coaches and personal trainers out there that tell you, like, you got to do more core stability stuff, and they have you dancing around on wobble boards and balls. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. The truth of the matter is that to increase your core stability, the stability in this area, you've got to strengthen in that vacuum fashion, and you do that by activating the thoracocolumnar fascia. A couple other things is it increases segmental mobility of the hips, your ability to anterior and posteriorly tilt, so you're not thrown forward all the time like I showed you before with your guts spilling out the front, and you're not tipped too far way back where some people look like they have no ass. You ever see people with just like a flat back and it just becomes legs? Well, those are people who have a posterior pelvic tilt and there's just no butt there. So by strengthening this vacuuming area, you're essentially building more segmental mobility of the pelvis that will prevent either one of those extremes. In the past, I've called that like your Donald Duck or your Pink Panther. A couple other things is going to decrease your risk for injury, because as you're axial loading with weight or playing football or rugby or any of these hockey, any sports where you're making contact, you've got more stability, increased hip extension like we talked about, and that's it. So I encourage you, there are a lot of things that Vince say that are just off the wall, weird and wild, but it turns out to be making a lot of sense later on if you take a good look. So this is just a little bit of a example of how, if you look a little bit deeper into some of the wacky ideas that he was presenting, that perhaps they made a lot of sense. So I encourage you, perhaps give up crunches for a little while, try some vacuuming, and let me know how it works out for you.